A few years ago, officials from the United States, France, and Africa brokered a peace deal in a small African country. A running civil war there had left about 5,000 dead in 3 years. But then, the peace accord began to break down in implementation, and when the president's plane was shot down, one faction responded by beginning the Rwandan genocide, which caused perhaps 800,000 deaths within a few weeks, the worst genocide since World War II. I'm telling you that story because I want to begin this session on a sober note. Sometimes agreements are so flawed or so badly implemented that they make things worse. The Hippocratic Oath essentially states the principle that doctors should do no harm. Negotiators should swear a similar oath. Of course, even the best doctors make mistakes, and so do skilled negotiators, but both must try to do as little harm as possible. As we saw in an earlier session, one way to do no harm is to test an offer against the measures of success we've developed. But before and after the handshake, there are other ways to make bad agreements better, to turn paper agreement into real understanding, and avoid implementation problems that can leave you wondering what went wrong. In short, there are ways to heal the deal. In this session, we'll look at a powerful way to spot time bombs in your proposed deal and fix them so they don't destroy someone. A simple way to turn an okay deal into a better one. A way to turn a paper deal into genuine collaborative relationship. And ways to anticipate conflicts and plan to resolve them amicably. We'll also look at a seemingly odd question for a course on negotiation that can expand your thinking about it. Are there ways to collaborate without negotiating? In our session on measures of success, we discovered that it's very easy to enter a deal that has time bombs. Time bombs, as we said, are gaps or deal terms that can cause serious foreseeable problems later on. Just being aware of their importance and being on the lookout for them can be a big help. But now let's go further and look at a tool that can help you spot and diffuse them. That is, let's see if we can develop a mine detector that can help you sniff out time bombs before they wind up in your agreement, waiting to go off. The tool I have in mind is a simple but powerful mnemonic I've designed called win-lose. It stands for what if, numbers, lawyers, and other side's expectations. Let's take a closer look at each part. One of the most important things you can do to spot time bombs is to worry. That is, to let your fears run free and ask yourself, what if this happens? What if that happens? To think in advance about the worst-case scenarios, to play out how the deal might work if bad things happen. Strategy experts call this scenario planning. For example, airplane engine designers routinely run a newly designed engine through extremes. To win Federal Aviation Administration certification, they test the engine by rushing far more water through it than it'll ever face in a storm. They fire dozens of chickens' carcasses through the engine to make sure it can survive a bird strike. They intentionally blow off a turbine blade while the engine is running at full speed to make sure it can still run. Then they put the engine on a test airplane and run it through still more worst-case scenarios. Fearsome tests. But it's nice to know they've done these tests when you're flying at 30,000 feet, going halfway around the world. Here, we're saying it's wise to put a proposed deal through similarly tough tests, to ask, what if this happens? To, in effect, fire some dead chickens at it and see if it still flies. But wait, isn't all this worst-case scenario planning just stinking thinking? It sounds way too pessimistic, doesn't it? Business people, for example, might hear all this what-if thinking and say, look, I can't achieve anything if I'm dwelling on the negative, and it's even faintly un-American. After all, the last 4 letters of the word American are I can. If I focus on all the bad things that could happen, I'll never do any good. It's far better if I just create my plan, negotiate deals with investors, partners, employees, and suppliers, and get on with it, right? And that's a fair point. So let's test it out by looking at that pillar of traditional entrepreneurship, the business plan. Every year, top business schools hold business plan competitions where top judges select from hundreds of entries the most promising student plans, the ones that are most likely to succeed as real businesses. Last year, I asked 45 of my executive students to do some detective work about those competitions. I asked them to find out how winners at one business school competition, a top one, had actually done 5 to 15 years later. The results? Of about 15 businesses, about 20-25% were showing real promise, typically newer businesses. About 20% were treading water, neither succeeding greatly nor sinking. And the rest, 50% or more, were missing in action or dead or never got started. And oh, by the way, plans that came in second place had a failure rate of about 75%. So out of perhaps 1,000 business plans and 10 years of competitions, perhaps 3 or 4 of the best were doing well, and most of the rest were struggling or dead. Not surprising. I once asked a senior venture capitalist how he read a business plan. Simply said, "We find the biographical section that describes the founders' backgrounds, then we keep it, and we throw out the rest of the business plan into the garbage." Why, I asked. Because, he said, hard experience has taught us that every business plan grossly exaggerates sales, underestimates costs, and has projections that are so over-optimistic that they're not worth worrying about. The real question is whether the founders are mature enough to understand that and know how to cope when problems inevitably arise. In short, venture capitalists know that an optimistic attitude can destroy your efforts. They want to know if you're ready for the dead chickens that life will fire at you. That means it can be a very good idea to anticipate the worst-case scenarios early on. And that's true for any negotiation, not just business. In peace talks, for example, what if one side commits low-level violations of the demilitarization clause in the peace treaty? What if the reins make it impossible for inspectors to check that soldiers are withdrawing? In family negotiations over travel plans, what if the plane is late and grandma can't walk fast enough to make it to the connecting flight? In a new car purchase, what if the car breaks down during the warranty period and you need a way to get to work while the dealer fixes it? And so on. In each case, you don't need to spot every problem, but just a few what-if questions can make a big difference. The next letter of the win-lose mnemonic, N, stands for numbers. The idea here, as we began to see in our session on research, is simple and powerful. It's a very good idea to master the numbers in a transaction and use them to answer serious questions about the implications of a deal. To a business person, that means looking at things in an accounting statement and testing it, looking for weaknesses, playing through different scenarios, and asking the spreadsheet specific questions about the deal. Will we have enough cash? What if mailing costs are high? How do we make money and when? And so on. To a consumer, number mastery means really understanding things like credit card interest charges, cell phone calling charges, and medical insurance deductibles. A student of mine was once trying to buy a car, but the dealer told him that a lease would be better for him. The dealer explained the numbers, but the student wasn't sure he understood. That was embarrassing because he was a finance student and thought he should have been able to get what the dealer was saying. But wisely, he asked for time to review the lease plan. Only when he spent hours reviewing it carefully with a calculator did he discover the lease would cost him far more than buying the car would. When he showed the numbers to the dealer said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." The next letter of the win-lose, L, stands for lawyers. Believe it or not, lawyers can actually help you negotiate better. I know you may think that lawyers are just a nuisance at best, deal killers at worst. I've heard leading executives say, you can get anything done if you keep the lawyers out of the room. But that said, lawyers may actually be able to do more good than you first might think. In part, that's because lawyers can spot problems, time bombs, before they wind up in a deal. Time bombs that a layperson might be unaware of. For example, imagine you're trying to work out your estate plans with your family. You want to be fair, and they all agree that they want you to give an equal amount to each of your heirs. But then your lawyer points something out. Your daughter has 3 children, and your son has 1. Should you divide the money up evenly between your children or evenly between your grandchildren? You hadn't thought of that, and neither had your family. But if you don't think about it and talk it through now, your will might create big conflicts for your family years from now. Experienced lawyers often are also wise business counselors who know where problems lie and how to fix them. To the point, a deal in principle is often missing answers to big questions. A good lawyer knows how to help you answer them. For example, you may decide that you want to partner with your best friend. Your lawyer may ask, okay, if one of you gets sick and can't work at all, what then? Will he still get half the profits? Your lawyer may wisely recommend that you buy insurance to cover the risk and avoid terrible fights at a terrible moment later on. In a sense, lawyers are trained time bomb detectors. Sure, they do kill some deals, but usually a skilled lawyer only urges you to kill an irredeemably bad deal that ought to die. Often, your lawyer can help you think through issues and fix terms that might have bitten you badly down the road. Even if you don't hire a lawyer, though, L is there to remind you that legal terms and fine print matter, and it's a very good idea to master the terms and conditions. Ever read a cell phone plan? True confession, I didn't read mine. I thought it gave me unlimited minutes for $59 a month. First month, I got a bill for $400. An hour-long conversation with a billing representative, and I understood everything has been fixed. Second month, I get a bill for $500. Another hour-long conversation. Next month, $600. I had a lot more hair before I signed that plan. Wish I'd read the fine print. To take one simple example you may face, many credit card agreements allow the credit card company to raise your interest rate to an astounding rate, 20%, 30%, or even more, if you miss a payment on a debt to a third-party creditor. It's called a cross-default provision, and it can actually ruin you. In fact, cross-default provisions in major loan agreements can lead major corporations to collapse like a financial house of cards. By defaulting on even a very small loan agreement, the corporation can trigger another fault in a larger agreement, and so on, until the company is at its lender's mercy. Lastly, the OSE stands for Other Side's Expectations. That is, are you a good match, and does your vision of the deal mesh well with what the other negotiator has in mind? That question gets at the fact that many negotiation love affairs wind up producing terrible marriages because the two sides are simply incompatible or have very different expectations. One wants to dominate the business. The other expects an equal partnership. One wants a quick profit. The other is a visionary who wants to grow the project over decades. Sometimes these conflicts create needless heartache and trouble that you could have avoided by going your separate ways or working them out beforehand. More generally, other sides' expectations means it can be quite wise to slow down and get a better sense of who and what your counterpart has in mind. To avoid the old saying, marry in haste, repent in leisure. So there it is, win-lose. What if, numbers, lawyers, and other sides' expectations. As you move nearer a deal, take that simple, powerful time bomb detector out and see if it doesn't save you from lots of grief. But there's another way to improve a fairly promising and tentative deal to, in effect, take a sad song and make it better. It's something called a second look meeting. The idea of a second look meeting is that there may be hidden ways to help one or both sides to do better without hurting anyone, and that by taking a second look, you might discover it. Imagine you've just worked out a tentative agreement with your family in California to visit them during the holidays. You've worked out dates, sleeping arrangements, day trips, ways to share costs, and so on. But as you wrap up the conversation, you add this. Okay, it looks like we have a good plan. Why don't we sleep on it and have a follow-up call in a day or two? Then, let's see if there's any way to make the plan better for you without making it worse, or for us, or vice versa. We can also see if there's a way to make it better for all of us. If we can't, we'll stick with this very promising plan. But if we take a second look, we may find we can make one or all of us even happier. The power of a second look meeting builds on the fact that it's easy to miss optimal trades. We naturally want to rush to a conclusion and celebrate any deal. But how cool is it when a supplier calls back and says, I gave our deal some more thought, and I realized there may be a way to help you save 10% on taxes if we do it slightly differently. And there may be other ways to make things better for you, even better for you beyond that. Would you like to talk about it? Now, I have to make a confession to you. We academic types love the idea of a second look meeting, but there is a problem with it. In practice, negotiators simply don't want to do more negotiating once they reach an agreement, much of the time. After all, negotiation is not leisure, and the idea of continuing the talks can seem time-consuming and burdensome. Also, if one side is unfamiliar with the idea, an invitation to a second look meeting can sometimes sound like the other side wants to unwind the deal and maybe renege altogether. Or they might fear it'll just cause one or both sides to reconsider. Or it can sound like the old trick, my boss says I need another $500 to sell the car. So if you're working with someone who's not familiar with the idea of a second look meeting, you may have to make sure that she's comfortable with it and explain that you're quite ready to commit to the first deal and will, unless you make it better for at least one side without hurting the other. You may want to set a time limit for the second look meeting. You may want to give a gesture of some kind that you really are prepared to commit and move forward. Okay, so imagine you've vetted the deal, taken a second look, finalized the terms, and signed the contract. Done, right? Maybe. But let's face it, even a carefully negotiated contract doesn't guarantee peace, love, and groovy vibes. In the construction industry, for example, it's extremely common for a contractor and a developer to wind up in litigation over some alleged performance breach, even though both sides carefully negotiated the terms. In fact, by the late 1980s, litigation over construction contracts had become so frequent that the Construction Industry Institute convened a task force to look for ways to reverse the trend. The task force recommended an idea it called partnering. It's based on the insight that the letter of the contract is one thing, working well together to perform it is another. Partnering seeks to bridge the gap by going beyond legal formalities and building the working relationship. With it, the parties start building the bridge right after the ink is dry on the contract. That is, they take some early steps to make sure everyone understands what the agreement is really about, what the goals are, how they'll work together as problems arise, and how they'll make sure they're making progress. Partnering draws in part on the work of Ian McNeill, a law professor who championed the idea that contracts must focus on relationships and be adaptable to change. That idea has deep parallels in Asian approaches to contract. A relational approach makes sense because no contract can anticipate every future event, so it pays to build in a relational shock absorber that can help the parties adjust without bitterness or resentment. That may be especially important in dealings between two different cultures that are prone to misunderstand each other. One of the models the task force used was an early partnering effort between the Army Corps of Engineers, part of the U.S. military, and a civilian construction company. These two very different organizations had agreed to build a dam together. Everyone's surprise, partnering proved to be a huge success. It produced major cost and time savings, and all parties highly praised the experience. The idea has spread, and while the record is somewhat mixed, some studies show it has produced similarly satisfying results in hundreds of cases. Today, people use partnering in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere around the world, and several business, legal, and engineering programs teach it. And today, any partnership can use a similar process, as David Gage notes in his book, The Partnership Charter. Here's how it works. Soon after you sign a contract, key figures from your side and the other side meet informally for a day or two with a facilitator. The facilitator leads you through team-building exercises and helps the group develop communication arrangements for the future. The group also creates a charter where all the key stakeholders commit to a couple of things. First, a mission statement of common goals. For example, we want to do the project on time, within budget, and safely. Also, they commit to a set of guiding principles and values. For example, we want to work as a team and solve problems creatively. The group also works out a dispute resolution plan that begins with low-level processes. If people can't work out a conflict there, they can refer it to their bosses, and so on until it's resolved. For example, the group might say, first our job site people will try to work it out. If they can't in 3 days, our middle-level people will talk it out. If they can't in 5 days, our senior people will talk. Separately, you also arrange for regular follow-up meetings to stay in good communication and measure progress achieving your goals and values using performance measures you've worked out during the session. You can also plan for follow-up workshops, debriefing sessions, award ceremonies, and joint training. But now let's turn to an array of ways you can work out contract problems without litigation. It's something we touched on briefly in an earlier lecture called Alternative Dispute Resolution, or ADR. As we saw there in Lecture 10, ADR offers a variety of ways to resolve disputes more inexpensively and satisfyingly than traditional litigation can. One example is mediation, where an impartial third party helps the parties negotiate, much like President Jimmy Carter helped the leaders of Egypt and Israel at Camp David. Another is arbitration, where an impartial third party who is not a judge hears the two sides' cases and then decides who wins what. And there are several other kinds of ADR too. I have a special fondness for mediation because I'm a trained mediator. Results vary, but I've seen its power. More than once, as I've mentioned, I've mediated disputes between wives and their husbands' mistresses, just to take one example. Between wives and their husbands' mistresses. And to my amazement, they settled and wished each other well. It wasn't me, it was the process. Mediation can be particularly worth considering because, unlike other methods, it can produce results that are creative and mutually satisfying. You can even do it while you're in the middle of another process, like litigation. Even parties to the best agreements can get into conflicts later on. So it can be a good idea to agree to a clause that spells out how you'll try to work out problems later on without litigation. That's called an ADR clause. It can be just a line or two in your contract, but it can change your life. Basically, it simply says that if a dispute arises, here is the ADR process you'll use. And you can add that if one doesn't work, you'll try another. In a sense, our whole course is about ADR because the most common kind of ADR there is negotiation. In 1963, social scientist Stuart Macaulay found evidence that when business people get into conflicts over a contract, they usually work it out without even calling a lawyer. So when problems arise, your negotiating skills may be your first best treatment option. You can build that into an ADR clause saying, first we'll try to negotiate. If that doesn't work, either party can ask for mediation and the other will agree to do so. But if mediation doesn't work, either party can ask for arbitration and will arbitrate. But there's another thing you can add to a contract that discourages litigation. It's a provision that makes litigation riskier and more costly for the loser. For example, you can agree that if there is litigation, the loser pays the winner's legal fees, or twice that amount. ADR shows up in lots of different negotiations. Major League Baseball contracts contain arbitration clauses. So do most union contracts. They're especially common in international contracts. Here's why. Imagine you sue someone from Japan in New York court and win. So you go to Tokyo to get a judge there to help you seize the other guy's assets. But the judge there may well say, "How do I know that this was a fair trial for my countrymen?" Judges are reluctant to enforce foreign judgments, in large part for that reason. But now imagine you go to the Japanese judge and say, "Your Honor, we didn't litigate. We arbitrated using a third party we agreed to as our contract called for." Now the judge is much more willing to help you because she knows that her countryman got a fair hearing. He agreed to arbitration and he helped pick the arbiter. Let me just add that arbitration is a mixed bag. Increasingly, it looks like litigation in its cost and time demands. But it is incredibly final. There are hardly any appeals allowed, so if you want finality, it can be a good choice. You may find you have to submit to arbitration. If you ever enter into a brokerage agreement, it's standard practice for the brokerage firm to require it. There are some advantages to consumers here. Typically, two arbitrators, an expert and a layperson, jointly hear the case to assure that the process is fair and not biased toward the broker. But why do brokers favor arbitration? Some experts suggest a key reason is because you can't get punitive damages in arbitration awards, among other things. So before you agree to a standard contract there or elsewhere, you may want to consider if that works for you. Oh, and by the way, studies find that if one side brings a lawyer to an arbitration and the other doesn't, guess who wins most of the time? That's right, the side with the lawyer. For this reason, some argue that arbitration is another kind of litigation, but all that said, it may have some saving virtues. Let's conclude with an odd question. Are there ways to avoid negotiation altogether and so avoid some of the problems we've sought to prevent and solve in this session? In a sense, much of our world is filled with them. In his theory of the firm, Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase essentially argued that the thing that defines how big a firm gets is the cost of negotiation, or as economists put it, transactions costs. When renting the truck, outsourcing the customer service, or hiring a law firm gets too expensive and hard to negotiate, a firm will do it in-house. It will buy the truck, hire workers, hire in-house counsel. In a sense, an organization is a way to avoid ongoing negotiation. Another way is to rely on social norms. In 1986, Robert Ellickson, a Yale law professor, wrote an article about a summer he spent in Shasta County, California. He wanted to see how ranchers and farmers handled conflicts, such as when cattle eats a farmer's wheat. Did they negotiate as Coase theorized in a separate and celebrated paper, or did they litigate, as Ellickson's fellow law professors would expect? He found they didn't do either. Instead, they lived by a well-developed set of social norms that basically guided their interactions most of the time. Usually, they would live and let live. A farmer would even shelter lost cattle and call the rancher to come and get it at his convenience. If a rancher was a jerk and didn't try to stop cattle from trespassing, then things might get testy. Farmers sometimes shot up a rancher's ranch sign as a protest. But they never litigated, and it never occurred to them to negotiate settlements. Ellickson found many examples of similar places where people evolved efficient norms for solving problems. 19th century whalers, for example, tacitly developed subtle rules for deciding what should happen when a harpoon whale gets loose and wound up and another whaling ship's possession. The rules depended on how easy it was to spot and identify a whale, which varied by whale species. It's possible that one of the main virtues of a culture is that it helps people get along without having to negotiate every problem, because the culture sort of does it for them. And let's face it, since negotiation is often not leisure, can you blame people for wanting an alternative to it? There's one final way we'll look at to solve problems without negotiation, though it's not a pretty one. It's to utterly absorb or dominate the other person. Joseph Stalin put it this way: death solves all problems. No man, no problem. Much of human history is a story of nation or tribe choosing to enslave, annihilate, or absorb another people, which kills the need to have to negotiate with them. But this last point brings us full circle. The premise of this course is that while negotiation is not leisure, it can often help us do much, much better than we first think possible, and in the process, save relationships that seem destined for alienation or violence. Developing that ability to heal the deal, to reduce the risk and increase the hope for good outcome, is therefore crucial. That's because it's one of the best ways to fight those who believe first in fighting and put into practice something Dwight Eisenhower said: the hope of the world is that wisdom can arrest conflict between brothers. I believe that war is the deadly harvest of arrogant and unreasoning minds. Here then are some challenges to help you practice healing the deal. The next time you're considering a cell phone contract, a car lease, a credit card, or another detailed contract, see what happens if you use the win-lose mnemonic to spot potential time bombs there. Invite someone to try a second look meeting and explain briefly why it might help. Invite a potential partner to create a partnership charter with you with the help of a facilitator. Invite someone you're negotiating a serious agreement with to add an ADR clause with you, and ask your lawyer about drafting one. In our next to last session, I'll try to rock your world again by taking a big risk. I'll try to draw together our course and many of the others in the Great Courses catalog with a single question, a question that I think deserves to be at the heart of our intellectual lives. Then, to make sure you can really keep the skills and ideas you've developed in our course, I'll try to distill them all down into just 5 words. And I'll give you a number of ways to use and develop your negotiating skills for months and years to come.